All right, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from in the world. Welcome to Crazy Talk. If this is your first time watching Crazy Talk is a Facebook Live TV show where I chat with people from all over the world about all sorts of things related to mental health. And I'm your host, Lee Thomas. If this is not your first time watching Crazy Talk, thank you so much for coming back. I'm glad we haven't scared you off. I'm really excited for this episode of Crazy Talk because I'm interviewing the incredible Lori Young. So Lori is the Provincial Peer Support Consultant for New Brunswick, and we actually just wrapped up I say we, like I'm taking credit for that.
You contributed
significantly. So there was a New Brunswick Provincial Peer Support certified, I'm getting the words mixed up.
Professional development
conference for all the certified peer supporters in New Brunswick. And so I had the great opportunity, thanks to Lori, to present at that. And so we are in the beautiful Villa Madonna right now in Rothesay, New Brunswick. And so Lori, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. Of course, I'm a little nervous. This is all new to me, this whole social media
technology
kind of thing. So it's great. Thank you for joining, or thank you for letting me join you.
No, I'm so glad. So I usually like to start off with kind of like
I really felt very passionate about the opportunity to kind of give back. And you hear a lot of people that kind of get interested in the peer support movement that really want to give back something valuable because they really valued what they were able to use as a resource. So whether it's a formal system or even just learning about your own illness and how to recover. It was really important to me, I guess, to be that person in my community. I come from a small community in Woodstock. And I really felt that, there wasn't a whole lot of conversation going on about that. And people were, the tendency was for people to come to me for consultation or even disclose secretly, I've struggled with this. And I thought, look, if I could take this even further or formalize it in some way so that it's really, doing good things for people, I really wanted that opportunity. So, I spoke openly about my relationship. I call it my relationship with bipolar disorder, the ups and downs and all the things that happen in between, like any relationship. And being open and honest about that was people benefited from that. So, and when I saw that happening, I really got invested. So, peer support's always been kind of close to my heart since then. So I was fortunate enough to be. The timing was quite perfect, actually, because the province was looking at doing this initiative. And so I applied for the job, the provincial level job, and was very surprised to be offered that position. So we've been working with the Department of Health ever since, CMHA and Department of Health, on a provincial initiative with peer support.
Yeah, and that's awesome. And we're so glad that you're doing that. Speaking on behalf of everyone, I guess I get to just do that. So I guess one of the things I was wondering, you talked about kind of wanting to give back, you know what I mean? For people so did you have, I guess, a positive experience when you were, because you talked about how people disclosed to you, did you have a positive experience when you were disclosing to people? Like, was there a peer supporter in your life, or did you have a really good experience in that respect?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I can kind of take it back a little further. I was diagnosed in my early 20s with bipolar disorder. Well, at that time, manic depression. Not a lot of people understood that. And I didn't understand that either. And being in my early 20s and knowing everything at the time, so that was very easy to reference. I knew that I was, I was sick, but when I was well, I was going to be well. When I look at peer support and what's available today, I didn't have that opportunity. Actually, I didn't know, and coming again from a small town, I didn't know one other person with the same diagnosis other than the people I met in the hospital, who, of course, were very ill. So I identified with that. And there was serious conversations about me not being capable of working or even living on my own after such an intense illness and in time in the hospital and controversial treatments and those kind of things. So I didn't really have anybody in my life that was identified as somebody having a mental illness, let alone bipolar disorder. But I do remember the day distinctly when I was going to church, and I came out of the church into the parking lot. And this was after a bout of illness, and people were kind of catching on that I was ill. And this woman, prominent woman from the town of Woodstock, came and disclosed that she had also struggled many years ago with a diagnosis of manic depression. And this woman was a mother. She worked full time. She was active in the church and in the community. And for the first time, I had probably been 8 years diagnosed at this point. And after those 8 years, having this woman come to me and tell me this gave me a whole new lease on life. I really felt like, I would be able to overcome this, be a productive citizen in my community and in society. Because before that, it had been that, maybe I was going to have to adapt to a life that was going to be sort of compromised. And internally, I don't know that I ever really believed that that was going to be the case. But outwardly, that's the message I was receiving. So of course, that's how I was believing things to be. But that moment and reconnecting with that woman on a couple of other occasions really changed things for me. And sharing for the first time some of those experiences outwardly were like fascinating. So I guess in that respect, with peer support, definitely I had a positive like moment or shift that was dynamic enough to change the course of my life. So, what kind of a gift is that to be able to give to other people? Really, like I count my blessings. I'm very grateful for that.
Absolutely. And it sounds like she was very much like, I think it was Laverne Cox in an interview. I might be wrong about that, but talked about possibility models, right? Like how important it is. And like, I mean, we talk about representation, whether it's in the media or in our own lives or whatever it is, that model of like, it's possible to live a different life than what everyone is telling us we're going to live. And that's like so important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it sounds like, and actually correct me if I'm wrong, because I might be wrong about this, but when I think of peer support, I often think of peer support that happens outside of the formal system. Mm-hmm. But peer support in New Brunswick is very much a part of the formal healthcare system. So are those, I guess, opposing dynamics, or do I just have the wrong idea about peer support, or...
No, I mean, peer support obviously has existed for a long, long time. People have connected under certain circumstances, all through our lives. We have sort of a formalized approach to that in New Brunswick at this point, where we're training people with lived experience that have a skill set that would be able to work in the community mental health centers throughout the province on FACT teams. And FACT teams are relatively new to the province as well, but the flexible, assertive community treatment teams that exist in each center in the province are equipped with, or will be equipped with, a certified peer support on that team. And that will provide sort of the perception of somebody with lived experience, not only to the people that are being serviced, but even around the table with the other people that are working in the FACT team, contributing that lived experience perception, which is so valuable, not just to the people that are being serviced, but to the people that are providing the service.
Yeah.
A lot of times there's things that are overlooked, or, this should link to this because it makes sense to me, but what's making it not link could be definitely something, a perception that somebody with lived experience could have.
Yeah. And there's kind of two threads that I want to follow up with on that. So I guess one of them is that idea of, the value of having a person with lived experience, not only for people like clients who are encountering the system, but also for, the people who are working within the formal system. Because I think even people who work in, or at least maybe this is just my experience, but even people who work within the formal system, like therapists and psychiatrists and that sort of thing, can still have these kind of distorted images of people living with mental health issues. Is that something that you've seen?
Oh, sure. And probably even like throughout my career, I've been involved with mental health and mental illness awareness kind of things. A lot of times, and they're the first ones to actually, be able to point out, like, look, I guess I never would have thought of that. I love those aha moments where, I just share in passing, that would have been helpful for me, or this would have been helpful for me when I was discharged from the hospital. In the circumstances around where I was hospitalized in the city, but I lived in a town an hour north of that. So upon discharge, I was disconnected from any of the resources that I had. So, and people didn't see that as a big problem. I was discharged. I should be happy. I'm in my community, but I was never lonelier. Mm-hmm. I had a regime, sometimes for up to 11 to 16 week hospitalizations. And then just to be kind of dumped back into my community without any resources. So that would be very scary for me. So a lot of that was a perfect example that I would share with case managers and psychiatrists that worked in Woodstock. Like, there needs to be some kind of an adjustment or some kind of recognition of the fact that there's a transition happening here, mm-hmm. and it's part of the recovery. And of course I was excited to be discharged, and I don't get me wrong, but there was a comfort level in the hospital when you were being looked after, and I didn't take my own pills. Everything was timed and regimed. And so, there's a transition. And so when I spoke more about that, the center in Woodstock was a little more receptive to, oh my gosh, yeah, I guess I never thought of that. I never thought, I just figured you'd be happy to be discharged and we would just see you and it would be all great. But there's still a lot of work that's got to be done with filling that gap.
Yeah.
So that's one example, I guess.
Absolutely. So I guess going back to kind of my other thread that I wanted to follow, although now there's 1,000 other threads I want to follow, but so the idea of certifying peer support, I think it's really interesting because on the one hand, like, you don't want just like, you know, Joe Blow being like, I'm a peer supporter now, everyone come talk to me, when they might not have the necessary training. But on the other hand, does it sometimes, you know, restrict the access to peer support because now, you know, you can't access peer support unless it's through the FACT team? Or have you found that, or is that not the case?
Well, we're starting to see evidence of that. The more we talk about peer support in the province and the more people are recognizing the value of peer support, we are seeing that people, you know, would like to access that. And even in my position, I've often accessed through CMHA to, you know, like, how do I get involved with you? How can I, you know, get peer support from my son or my brother or for myself? And, you know, it's not like that. We don't get certified and like hang a shingle and like, you know, peer support services available here, because it's not like a counseling kind of thing. So there's a lot more to it. In the certified peer support program that we're teaching now for people to work on the FACT team is very focused on how to use your story appropriately, how to work within a treatment team with different diverse backgrounds. We provide a special service in the sense that we can connect with people in a little bit of a different way, which is often discouraged in other disciplines. Yes. You know, like it's certainly not encouraged. I think people are a little more free with that now, but like specifically peer support will be able to provide kind of the insight and inspire hope and those kind of things in a different way and a different connection with people. And so people are recognizing the value of that. And so they do want access to it. And right now it is just on the FACT team. We have people that are working, that we've got 10 employed in the province right now out of potentially 15. So the idea is for peer support and the Peer Support Initiative in New Brunswick to move forward, providing peer supports in the community, so different communities throughout the province. There's a lot of different agencies and organizations that we can partner with and see what the needs are and see what we can do for providing peer support training that would be, you know, conducive for putting people in the community. So it will be accessible, and I look forward to that. Actually, it's evolving and it'll change. Probably over the next 5 years, we'll see, you know, a big bust of this kind of thing. But right now, it's limited to the FACT team, and all the training is focused on that too.
Okay. So one of the things you said that I really, really love is this idea of, you know, peer supporters learn how to tell their story in a helpful way. Because, I mean, I think of myself as, you know, a storyteller, and I go around to schools and I talk about my story. And that's something that has evolved for me, because when I first started telling my story, I didn't realize that there could be an unhelpful way to tell my story. I was just kind of like, blah, I was putting it all out there. You know what I mean? And it's, since then I've really done a lot of work in terms of, you know, what aspects of my story are helpful and what aspects of my story are not necessarily helpful. And I know the line for me is like, if it's something that I'm saying because they need to hear it, then I'm going to say it. But if it's something that I'm saying because I need to say it, I save that for therapy, which is kind of my distinction. But how do you, because I think there is, because so many people are not telling their stories about mental health, there is kind of this like, oh, I've gotten my opportunity, so I'm going to get it all out there. Right. So how do you parse apart what is and is not a helpful part of a story?
Well, what you said actually is usually very helpful, and kind of like, you know, the philosophy that's grounded in is that, you know, like if it's going to be more helpful for you, then it's quite likely not going to be part of the conversation, or it's discouraged. If it's providing insight with somebody that's, you know, experiencing the same thing, then you're providing information and insight that maybe they don't have. And so this, you know, it's not a science necessarily. Okay. We talk about some of the restrictions and some of the things, and especially with the relationship in the formal system, where there has to be sort of a you know, the relationship can't be on a parallel, right? It's got to be, you know, you're part of a treatment team, right? So it's not, you know, becoming friends with somebody and then exchanging things. So like, I'm getting helped and that person's getting helped. We have to stay away from that, which that's very difficult. It's a very difficult line to kind of dance around. But what you said is perfect. Like, you know, if you're saying it because you feel like you need to kind of unload it, or you need to, you know, maybe get recognition for it or feedback or validation, it's quite likely not going to be as helpful for that other person. You need to kind of dissect that and tell people what they might benefit from as far as insight
Mm-hmm.
that they may not have, or knowledge that they may not have.
Yeah. Okay. One of the things I did want to ask, so you mentioned in the bio that you sent us that you were on, and I might get the name of this wrong, I'm sorry, but you were on like a provincial consulting team about community treatment orders.
Oh, yeah.
So that's something I posted about to my page a while ago. Was just, I know when those changes came in, they also made, you know, some changes to the way that the Mental Health Act is written and that sort of stuff. So one of the things that I found really interesting is interesting and like, and I still am processing my opinion about it. So I guess I don't have an opinion. I just have lots of questions about it. Is the change to the Mental Health Act that was like, it changed from, you know, immediate risk of harm to themselves or others to potential for deterioration or something like potential for significant deterioration. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Not directly, of course, no. The task force that we work together on kind of developing or recommending some things for the with it's supervised community care in New Brunswick. So CTO is the term that people are more familiar with.
Okay.
But SCC, the supervised community care, is what's actually been sort of adapted. That's what we call our version of CTO. And there were a lot of recommendations and a lot of changes to the Mental Health Act. My role, I guess, primarily was to provide you know, sort of the insight from first voice and having lived experience. I think, you know, New Brunswick, one of the things I was most proud of is that we were able to advocate for a consent model of that as well. So, you know, when people hear CTO or, you know, even supervised community care, there's a notion to kind of believe that it's inhumane and, you know, we're stripping the human rights and those kind of things. And, you know, like that's always going to be part of the discussion. But, we were able to, I think we're the only province actually in Canada that has a consent model. So people can actually agree and consent to being treated in the community and agree to all the parameters that are provided, and know that those resources will be made available to that person. So, you know, looking back on my life, you know, like I don't know that I would have qualified necessarily for supervised community care, but I would have consented to that probably at some points, and probably my recovery would have been less time, or, you know, less time even in the hospital, which would have been also great, you know, recovering in my own community. So, so I can't speak to exactly like, you know, all the changes, those specific ones to the Mental Health Act. But yes, my role on the task force was to really provide the experience of somebody that, you know, could have benefited, or somebody that's, you know, had issues with anger and those kind of things that, you know, probably were would have been better suited for a CTO or supervised community care.
Yeah. And you said something that like really resonated with me, was that whole, like, I'm not sure I would have qualified for that. And like, and I definitely get that, like, there does need to be different, maybe levels isn't necessarily the right word, but different methods of care, right? Like not everyone who's experiencing a mental health issue necessarily needs to be hospitalized or necessarily needs this. But I think a lot of people do struggle with this idea of, you know, I don't qualify, right? I don't qualify to get the help, or I'm overqualified. That's you know what I mean? Like sometimes you'll approach, you know, a counselor and I see this a lot in post-secondary settings where, you know, counseling is limited to 6 sessions or that sort of thing. And you're like, I have a chronic mental health condition. And they're like, oh, you are overqualified for this. Like you are out of our pay grade sort of thing. But then you have the opposite where, you know, you might go to the hospital and say, I really, really need to be hospitalized or that sort of thing. And they're like, well, you're underqualified to be here. So like, how do you manage, I guess, the frustration? Because it always comes back to frustration for me, but that frustration with the system, or that feeling of like, I don't fit, I don't qualify, or I'm overqualified. And how do people negotiate that?
Well, you know, when it comes down to, you know, criteria, I think a lot of times, you know, we get caught up in that whole criteria piece. You know, I did a lot of work that not defined as peer support, but it was very, very similar to that at Hayward House Recovery Center. Shout out to Woodstock.
Woo.
Yeah, I think we didn't base our services on criteria and how different that looked. You know, I didn't have to know people's diagnosis. I didn't have to know how chronically ill they were, how long they'd been sick, anything like that. We just dealt with people, and so the criteria piece was put aside. But there is, of course, a lot of frustration, people that are really struggling, but, like, well, they haven't been struggling for more than 24 hours, or they're not in imminent danger. They're not suggesting they're going to cause harm to themselves or others. So they don't quite meet, the mobile crisis, or, like you're
get a little bit sicker.
Yeah. If you're just
Please.
a little bit sicker, then we might be able to talk about that. So yes, and I mean that exists in other areas too, and domestic violence or things like that. The police will respond after something happens. Those kind of things are always going to be frustrating, I think. But in mental health, of course, because you're talking about somebody's care, somebody's health, and somebody's well-being, and you weren't trying to do the right thing, but denied. You didn't quite meet the criteria for that. Yeah, absolutely.
So speaking of care and health and well-being, so we took a deep breath, where's Lee going with this now? So I know a lot of the times, because conversations about peer support are conversations that have happened in a lot of the organizations that I work with, that I volunteer with. And one of the common concerns that people have is like, peer supporters are going to get burned out. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you're like the queen of the peer supporters, right? You're like the peer supporters are supporting the peers, and you're supporting the peer supporters. You're like the watchers watching the watchmen, right? So how do you deal with, helping people while also maintaining your own mental health, and helping people help people while also helping yourself? Like, how do you balance all that?
Oh God. Well, yeah. Well, first of all, you make it sound so like I do this magically all the time. I have to work on that. That's something I have to be very conscious of and work on it daily. I do have that tendency. I mean, I have a big heart. I want to help and fix and do all the things that we're taught not to do all the time. We just executed this conference, and revisiting some of these things, like being kind to yourself, self-care, and all those things. I don't think we can sit through too many of those kind of things just to be reminded of like things that we need to do to look after ourselves. I guess I've learned, now I've got this infinite wisdom. I'm 46 years old now, so I have this wisdom to impart. But I think I have learned that that whole analogy of that you can't pour from an empty cup. It's really important to me to stay well, so I can be accessible to other people, and make sure that I can support and help them, and so that whole self-serving piece I can deflect, and just, in order to be available to people, I need to look after myself. Now, that doesn't mean that always happens. I fall victim to the same things as other people do. And in peer support, of course, you're giving a lot of yourself, but I work with a very supportive bunch of people, of course, and, I think that does help too. Like, we're all kind of doing the same kind of thing with our big, huge hearts and generous, dispositions. So I think, but I do have to be mindful about that, like, even daily, just to be sure that I'm available, and setting a good example. I guess that's pressure that I put on myself, I'm sure. But, being identified as the provincial peer support consultant sometimes has some weight to it. And I feel like, look, I need to set a good example. So it's really important to me. So I do work really hard at it, but I by far have not perfected it. No.
Yeah. And I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to, where it's like, I know I need to be taking care of myself, if only so I can take care of other people, right? Like, ideally, we want to get to a point where we're like, I'm taking care of myself because I deserve it. Sure. But I'm in the same boat where it's like, I'm taking care of myself because that enables me to take care of other people, or to help other people, and I get some of that self-worth and some of that self-value out of it. So it is one of those things. I can't believe it, but we are basically out of time, which is wild. It flies by, right?
Flies by.
So for people who are watching this and are going, oh my goodness, this Lori person is incredible. I want to get in touch with her, or I want to know, what can I do next to find out more about peer support or anything like that? Like, the folks who are watching, what would you like them to do next?
Well, if they're interested in the peer support program in New Brunswick primarily, I would love to be, if you would like to reach out, I'm available by email. I work at the Canadian Mental Health Association in Fredericton, CMHANB in Fredericton. So Lori.young@cmhanb.ca.
And we'll put that in the comments after this.
Put that in the comments. Yes, and I welcome anyone that has any kind of, questions, suggestions, concerns, needed clarification, any of those kind of things. I would be happy to have a conversation with you.
Okay, fabulous. Well, Lori, thank you so much for being on the show.
This
I really
was great.
appreciate it. This has been so much fun. We've had a great little time. Thank you to Villa Madonna for the free Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
And so if you're watching this episode and you're going, wow, Crazy Talk is so much fun. I would love to get episodes of Crazy Talk directly to my inbox. You can do that by signing up for my mailing list at leethomas.ca, or I will put a link directly to the mailing list in the comments below at the end of this show. If this episode resonated with you, or if you know someone who might be interested in hearing about peer support in New Brunswick, feel free to, share it. Feel free to like it. Feel free to leave a comment, even if you're watching this even if you're watching like the recording of this. Other than that, thank you all so much for joining us. I really, really appreciate it. And we will see you next week at 12:30 Atlantic right here. Thanks so much and have a great day, guys.